I remember a time right after I graduated from Duke Divinity School, I was sticking around an extra year in Durham, North Carolina for my fiance at the time. Now my wife was a year behind me at Duke. So I was going to wait around so we could plan a wedding and get married in North Carolina before moving to wherever it is we were going next. And for that year, I was finding myself for the first time without a plan, without a direction, even without a sense of purpose. Up until that point in my life, I had been a student. I had been a member of my household growing up in San Antonio, and then afterward I had roommates that I lived with who were also students. I played tennis. I had all these ways of defining myself and filling my days, my hours with purpose. But for this first time upon graduation, I didn't have a plan. I knew what I was going to do in the years to come. I wanted to be ordained and be a pastor in the United Methodist Church. But for that year, between graduation and getting ordained and returning to Texas, where I could be a pastor, I found myself without a direction in North Carolina. And it was really scary to come to the end of myself and the end of my vision and to not know what to do. So I started applying for jobs at churches because that's what I had degrees in. And several different interviews came by, and every single one of them turned me down, which I was also not used to. Yeah, believe it or not, I had succeeded in my life up until that point. But here, I was getting told no. And for a few weeks, I worked at a coffee shop on Franklin Street in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is a hard place for a Duke Blue Devil to be. Until finally, a church gave me a chance. They were looking for an interim person to lead their youth and kids ministry. It was a church plant that had just built a building and were figuring out their own next direction, their steps of what it meant to be the body of Christ in Morrisville, right near the airport in Durham. And so they hired me for 9 months. And this time I was determined to make something of myself, to really make it worth their while. I was going to prove to them, justify that it was worth it. And I started pouring myself into their work and showing up and trying to bring all my seminary education to these poor church people who didn't know what to do. And I was tasked with working with a congregant at that time who had just moved to North Carolina from the D.C. area. Mike was his name. Mike had worked in the federal government, had worked his way pretty high up in politics. And then he retired with his wife, and they moved just outside of Raleigh, and they started attending this church in Morrisville. And he said he was interested in discipleship, and part of my job was discipleship, so we started working together. And the first meeting we had, I started laying out all these visions and ideas that I had about what disciples do, what we could do as a church, how we could change the world from this corner of Morrisville as a new church start. Mike listened to me for a bit. Then Mike simply said, Reed, I came from a church right outside of D.C., and my pastor there used to tell me that the good news of the faith was not go and do. The good news of the faith is that it has been done. And I had been a Christian all my life. I'd grown up in the church. My dad was a pastor, and yet for the first time, this was hitting me different in my life. As someone without direction who had seized upon an opportunity, determined to justify my purpose and place in this world, I was hearing this call from Jesus through Mike to chill out, to take it easy, to just relax. I wonder how many of us need that message now, in this day. John 21 is a funny story. Last week we talked about Jesus appearing in the locked room on the evening of Easter, and then a week later appearing to the disciples when Thomas is now with them, proving himself to be alive, to have overcome death. But then we get to this story in John 21, and it's like none of that ever happened. Peter and some of the disciples are hanging out, seems to have gone back to Galilee. And Peter says, well, I don't know what to do. I guess I'll go fishing. Go back to what I used to do before I met Jesus. It's a strange story, kind of tacked on at the very end of John's gospel. I wonder why. Could it be because this story was so important to the evangelist that he didn't want to leave it out? He wanted it to be the final word, not just for those who first heard it, but for you and for me. What does Jesus have to say to us through these words today? Well, first, I find it interesting that after these crazy weeks the disciples have had, after entering Jerusalem with Jesus in that triumphal entry on what we call Palm Sunday, And then that week playing out where Jesus seems to be instigating. And then when the empire lays the hammer down on Jesus, arrests him, crucifies him as a rebel, an imposter king. And then we have the bewilderment of his resurrection and appearing to disciples, Mary, and then the 10, and then the 11 with Thomas with them. I wonder if they just can't make sense of life anymore. And then all of a sudden, verse 1 of chapter 21, Jesus isn't with them anymore. He's gone. And for the first time, these disciples, for the first time in 3 years, they are like sheep without a shepherd. They have no direction, no purpose, no sense of meaning. Because for the past 3 years, they had spent every waking moment with Jesus, their rabbi. And then they had gone through this climactic week in Jerusalem. And then all of a sudden, the very basic assumptions they held about life and death seem to have been turned inside out. And now they're left empty-handed? It's no wonder Peter goes back to what he knows. What do you do when you don't know what to do anymore? Well, Peter returns to the thing that he knew before he met Jesus, fishing. And so they go back on the lake to try and make sense of their lives once again. Today in the modern era, I think we face a deep anxiety about purpose and meaning in our lives. What's this all about? What's the point of life? Where do I get a sense of value? What am I contributing to the wider good? Or how do I know if I'm living a good life? These are questions that our society, that people all around us, that even you and me ask regularly. And we have all kinds of ways of answering that question nowadays. Some of us pour ourselves into our careers and we judge our merit and value by the titles next to our names, or maybe the number we make at the end of the year, before tax, of course. Maybe for some of us, it's parenting. We pour ourselves into the role of parent, and we compare with other people on the Facebook groups about how well we're doing. And maybe I'm a better parent than that person, or I could never be as good as them. Maybe for some of us, it's leisure activities, the vacations we take, the fun things we get to do, pouring ourselves into our fandom of sports teams. Maybe it's our political parties, whatever it is. We have all kinds of ways of figuring out how to justify our existence on earth. This is why I matter. This is why I belong. There's no shortage of options in this buffet of life that promise you meaning and satisfaction. And we give ourselves away to them time after time. This will help me feel at ease. Paul Tillich, who was a 20th century Christian philosopher who Chris Estes would love to talk to you about sometime, he talked about those three kinds of anxieties that the world faces: the anxiety of death, the anxiety of guilt. But nowadays, he says, it's the anxiety of emptiness and purposelessness. And to that, the church has a message. We look around the world, or maybe we look at ourselves, and we see ourselves giving more and more to these things that we think will deliver on value, on meaning and purpose. And more, we find the pressure building. We find ourselves being more frustrated because they don't deliver on what they promise. We get that raise, we get that title, we get that acclamation in the Facebook group, whatever it is. We win the election, and then we find out not much has changed. There's still this hole inside of me that I'm still working day and night to fill. We get to verse 3 in chapter 21, and we find that the disciples have been out all night on the boat, trying to catch something. They didn't even catch a rubber tire in the lake. Nothing, it says. Futile. Fruitless. Until, at dawn, Jesus appears on the shore. At the very end of their line, you might say, the disciples meet the risen Christ once again. And in his presence, they do find satisfaction. They do find meaning and purpose. They find success even as their net is filled with 153 fish, apparently. And then they come ashore. And can you imagine that interaction? If we take John 21 at its face value, These are the disciples who abandoned Jesus in his hour of need. They left him, watched him get arrested and crucified, pretended not to know him. And then he appears in the locked room. He gifts them the Holy Spirit. And what do? They do nothing. Apparently, they just sit around wondering what's next. Can you imagine that encounter with Jesus? How awkward that would have been. What were they fearing in that moment? Do you think they were expecting Jesus to show up and rebuke them? To lay the hammer down on them and say, how could you? To finally bring retribution. You did this to me. I'm going to pay you back. But what do they get from Jesus? They get a breakfast. They get a barbecue on the beach. They get a place to sit. They get a community to belong to. They receive relief. Not judgment, not shame, not condemnation, not end of relationship. They are gifted love, belonging, like it never happened. You see, I find John 21 to be such a gift to us in this day and age. We who try day and night, hour after hour, to make sense of our lives, to justify why we're here, and then we get to this story and Jesus says, you can bring that net ashore, but go ahead and lay it down. I've got the fish and the bread already on the grill for you. Take a seat. You must be tired. Relax in my presence. What Jesus gives us is not shame or condemnation or judgment. Jesus gives us belonging. He gives us love. He gives us what we really need. Mercy. Time after time. Like he never runs out. It's bewildering. In a world that says, keep trying, keep going, keep doing, Jesus says, take a seat. I've got what you need. This book just came out this week, and I've started reading it. It's called The Big Relief. It's by a writer named David Zoll, who loves talking about grace. And his analogy for grace in this book is the big relief. And I love this question that he poses to us in the book. He says, in the wake of the big relief, in the wake of grace, the question of life becomes one of freedom. What would you do? What risk would you take? What would you say if you knew you couldn't fail? What would you do? What risk would you take? What would you try in life if you didn't have to do anything? A terrifying thought, but one of freedom. Can you imagine the church letting people off the hook like that? You don't have to do anything. It's been done. Now what? We fear that people will just run amok. But what if they've been waiting for this very moment for that kind of relief? That they've been waiting for someone to come to them and say, it's okay. You don't have to anymore because Jesus has. What if the church became a place of refuge, of respite? What if it showed up in the world offering that kind of message rather than one of condemnation or guilt or rejection even? What if the church just stood there and said, come have a seat. There's a spot for you. There's enough to go around. You can relax because you already belong. Because your name's already part of the group. Because there's a spot for you in this fold. We've been waiting for you like Jesus on the beach. What if that was the message? How would that turn the world upside down? What if that became the pattern of discipleship rather than these programs and ministries that seminary students like me dream up? What if we merely reminded people and provided them the relief they so desperately are craving? That you don't have to go and do. That it has been done. That there's freedom to be the person you've always dreamed and desired to be, trusting that God can work even in that. What would that look like? How would you show up differently in your relationships? How would you show up differently on Sunday mornings? How would you show up differently in Common Space or at Tazay? How would you show up differently as a neighbor, a coworker, a parent, a friend? Everything would look different if we became people and places of refuge and relief. I think that's the key to the very end of this passage. Jesus encounters Peter, seems to pull him aside from the rest of the group for a second. Maybe he does it in front of him, I don't know. But 3 times he says, "Do you love me?" Obviously an allusion to the 3 times that Peter denied knowing Jesus. So there's some kind of redoing or making up or undoing of the guilt and the condemnation that Peter might have felt in that moment. But I wonder if that simple question, "Do you love me?" and then that simple response, "Feed my sheep," is the key to all of this. That if we really do love God, if we're not afraid of encountering God, that if we really do feel safe in God's presence, that we can't help but be conduits and channels of that love. We sang about it just now in King of My Heart. Becoming the kind of people who are having rivers of life flowing out of them. Frank Lake was a Christian psychologist, and he talked about how we often dream of the human life as this construction of a container, that we want something good to be in by the end of our lives. When you look inside this box of my life, you're going to find something good. But Lake says we get it all backwards when we view it that way. That in fact, the goal is not to be this self-contained box, but to be a channel, a river of grace and of energy from God. And he says, perhaps the whole point of life is to have that bottom knocked out of that box, thereby ruining it as a container, but making it satisfactory as a channel. Here in this moment, in this place, among these people, the whole point is relief. To gather together and to exhale. To realize that when we have our hands emptied, we can finally be given the thing that we've always wanted. And there's no better place to encounter that than here at the table. That's already set, by the way. You didn't have to bring your fish forward. Jesus has already provided what's needed. And you know what's fascinating? Sunday after Sunday, when we celebrate at the table, we have leftovers. And sometimes some of the kids in our congregation come and they snack on it, which is great. Sometimes it goes to the birds outside. But I don't think it's an accident. There's some left over because there's always more for people who are not yet here. There's more for the next time when somebody comes seeking relief. Here we proclaim, it has been done. Here we proclaim, you belong. Here we proclaim, Christ gives us what we truly, really need. And in that, we can rest.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time